Hi, welcome to my first lecture on the Nimzo-Indian defense. The Nimzo-Indian defense is a queen's pawn opening. So the Nimzo-Indian starts off by d4. And then in most of our games I've been covering, black's been playing d5 to help control the center. But the Nimzo-Indian starts off by playing knight to f6. So why did black play knight to f6? Well, one thing, he plans to try to control the center or attack the center with his pieces, and then maybe attack it with his pawns. So sometimes, or the theory is let white set up a center with his pawns and then attack it with the pieces and then possibly with the pawns. So by knight to f6, black is stopping white's plan because white wants to play e4. So the move knight f6 actually stops white from playing e4, and black has done this with not moving a pawn. So white will continue with playing c4. Once again, a pawn move from white, a sort of a flank pawn, controlling the d5 square. And then black will play e6, mainly to free this bishop right here. So black has to free its pieces, so it's going to have to make a couple pawn moves. And the one black is choosing to make is e6, which does help control d5, which is where, when white played c4 was helping to control d5. So in response, black plays e6, helping to control that square and also releasing the king's bishop. And then in the Nimzo-Indian, white plays c3. And then this is to, white is getting, developing a piece and hopes to play e4 next move. One of his objectives of white is to get an e4. And now black plays bishop to b4. And what this does, it does create a pin. Now white cannot play e4 because black had just captured right away. And that's what it's doing. So in the Nimzo-Indian, what black is really trying to do is control these two squares, d5 and e4, especially e4. Now notice with the pin, black does completely control e4. So now white has one of two options that I'm going to cover. There's a lot of variations. The two major ones are where white plays queen to c2, and the other one where white plays e3. The queen to c2 is known as the classical line, or the classical variation, and e3 is what's known as the Rubinstein variation, and I want to cover the rest of the Rubinstein variation now. So like I said, the Rubinstein starts off by playing e3. What this move does is that it helps support the center, d4, but it does sort of shut in the bishop on c1. But now white plans on playing bishop to d3. We've seen this before, very sort of a common setup to play bishop to d3, where the bishop eyes the king side. And then white will also develop the knight, usually to f3, but it can be played to e2, and then white will castle. And then white just has to figure out what to do with the bishop on c1. How is that going to be developed? But let's see how the rest of the Rubinstein continues from here. Black will castle. Maybe I'll just back up a move. Black does want to play, wants to sort of play these two pawns out, and it could play c3. Notice that it can't play, the d pawn out, because that would leave this diagonal here open, meaning white could then play the queen to here, checking the king, and then forking this bishop right here if black was to move this pawn right here. So first black castles, so black gets increased king safety. Now it's able to play to advance its d-pawn. White will play bishop to d3, a very common move in the queen's pawn opening. And then now black plays d5, striking at the center, going for central control, especially e4. Once again, like I said, black is striving to control the center, especially e4. That pawn moves helps to do that now. And now white will develop the knight and to f3. It is also common to play the knight to here, because if this bishop ever captures, then if the knight was on e2, it could just recapture. But with the knight on e2, it's sort of in a passive position. It's really just defending things. The knight to f3 here, the knight is more in an active role. It also helps control, d5, and also can help, now that we know the black king is on the king side, this knight is able to jump into the attack if necessary. It was on e2, it may need an extra jump, and time is sometimes everything in an attack. Now black will play c5. If you don't know, usually black just played d5 on the previous move, and sometimes the c5 and d5 moves are switched around. So that's common. Just sort of depends on black's flavor, or what his personality is. And c5 is striking at the center with a with the c pawn. And now we sort of have, anytime you see the situation of these four pawns, sometimes white or black, depending, is going to maybe get an isolated pawn, which is known as a weakness. And also with c5, black is able to bring this knight out. White will now castle, getting the king into safety, because on the previous moves, the two previous moves from white, white has moved the bishop and the knight to prepare castling. And now this is where sort of we have another fork in the road for black, and hopefully I'll be able to cover the second fork in the road. But knight to c6 is the main line, continuing the main line in the Rubinstein variation. This knight here is attacking the center, especially this pawn. So now d4 is again attacked. Now white will play a3, basically putting the question to the bishop: what do you want to do? Back off or capture? And then black will capture and the recapture. And then black will now capture on c4. This forces white to waste some time, but what black gives up though is some control on e4. But now that the bishop's moved away, black does control e4 once again, and white would have to waste the move coming back to try to control it. So let me try to back up if I have time. Just have a little bit of time. So the seventh move for black was where black played knight to f6, the main line, but black could also play d takes c4, forcing white to waste some time. And now I have very little time left. The next move from black will be knight on b to d7, and then queen e2. White's probably planning on pushing this e pawn up. b6. It's very common for black to put this bishop on the diagonal, attacking the king. Rook to d1. We've seen these type of moves in other openings, and the reasons are basically the same. So now we're centralizing the rook to an open or a file that's soon to be open. C takes d4, e takes d4. giving white an isolated pawn, but in turn for the isolated pawn, white does control the e5 square, and that's going to have to do it for this lecture.